Humiliated by her cruel ex's words, "No one will ever marry you," she's left broken and alone, convinced she'll never be chosen. But fate flips when the most feared, powerful vampire king marks her as his bride, turning her shame into envy and her weakness into a hidden power. Now she must survive court conspiracies and dark secrets, because being chosen by a king can be deadlier than being rejected. The first time Lyra heard the word chosen in the palace, it wasn't spoken like a blessing. It was whispered like weather, something that happened to other people, for reasons no one fully understood. She was standing in the linen corridor beneath the west stair, folding napkins that smelled faintly of rosemary and candle smoke, when two kitchen girls slipped past with a basket of apples. Their voices floated back, soft as wool. "They say His Majesty will choose again this year," one said. "Choose what?" the other asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "A human. For the vow." Lyra kept folding. She pressed each crease with the heel of her hand until it lay flat, calm, obedient. The napkins were all the same size, all the same pale color, and still they could be made to look uneven if you weren't careful. She had learned that people were like that too. A month before she came to the palace, Lyra had been told something else, something that had stuck inside her like a thin thorn. "No one will ever marry you," her ex had said, his face red with a kind of embarrassment that he turned into anger. "You're too quiet. You make everything heavier than it needs to be." He had spoken as if he were announcing a fact, as if he were doing her a favor by saying it first. She remembered the way her hands had curled around the edge of the table to keep from shaking. She remembered how she hadn't begged. She had just nodded once, because dignity sometimes looked like silence when you couldn't afford to break. Now, inside a palace ruled by vampires, marriage was not a simple promise between two people. It was a law, a symbol, an old ritual meant to bind the living and the undying into something that resembled peace. The humans in the palace called it a vow. The vampires called it a courtesy. Most people called it none of their business, because anything involving a king carried an invisible weight. Lyra folded the last napkin, slid it into the stack, and told herself the same thing she told herself whenever her thoughts drifted too close to that thorn: keep your hands busy. Keep your heart steady. Don't ask to be seen. Her life in the palace was made of small duties and careful steps. She rose before dawn, when the stone floors still held the night's chill. She carried warm water to the servants' washroom, mended torn cuffs in the seamstress corner, and spent long afternoons in the laundry chambers where steam gathered in pale clouds and made the world feel softened around the edges. The palace itself was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Candles burned with steady flames even when drafts moved through the corridors. Velvet drapes hung heavy over tall windows, as if the building preferred to keep the outside world at a respectful distance. Sometimes Lyra would see a vampire noble cross a hall, tall, composed, eyes like polished river stones, and she would lower her gaze not out of fear exactly, but out of habit. Humans were meant to be useful and unobtrusive. That was the rule everyone understood without being told. And yet there were moments that didn't fit the rule. In the mornings, a vampire librarian named Sir Caldema sometimes paused beside the servant's water barrel, gloved hands resting on his cane, and said, "Good morning," as if it mattered whether the day was good for her too. His voice held no warmth, but it held a kind of careful fairness. In the gardens, old Mora, the head cook, human and broad-shouldered, would slip Lyra a heel of honey bread with a gruff, "Eat. You're too thin." Mora did this without looking at her, as if feeding someone were a task like any other, but Lyra had learned to recognize kindness that wore practical clothing. The only one Lyra never saw clearly was the king. Everyone felt him in the palace the way you felt the shift before rain. The air grew still. The servants walked a fraction more softly. The vampires straightened, their voices lowering to a respectful murmur. Once, from the far end of the Hall of Mirrors, Lyra had glimpsed a tall figure moving behind a procession of attendants, cloaked in dark velvet that swallowed the light. She had seen silver hair like moonlit water, and a face turned slightly away, as if even his profile belonged to a story not meant for ordinary eyes. After that, she didn't look again. Not because she wasn't curious, but because she was tired of wanting things that weren't for her. Her small difficulty came quietly, as most real ones did. One afternoon, while she was returning clean table linens to the banquet storage, Lyra found a child sitting on the floor by the pantry door. He was a human page, maybe 9 or 10, in a too large uniform with brass buttons. His cheeks were blotched with the evidence of crying, though he was trying to swallow it down with the stubbornness of the young. Lyra slowed her steps. "Are you lost?" she asked. He shook his head quickly, eyes down. "No." The way he said it sounded like a plea not to be questioned. Lyra understood that too well. She set the linen basket down and sat on the stone floor a little distance away, leaving him room. After a moment, he spoke without looking at her. "I broke something." "What did you break?" Lyra asked gently. He hesitated. "A glass vial. It was on the steward's tray. It rolled off and his throat tightened. It had something inside. Like red ink." Lyra pictured the great steward, a vampire named Lord Harver, who ran the palace with a clean, sharp efficiency. She had seen him once correcting a servant's posture with a glance so cold the servant turned pale. There was no shouting in the palace. There was simply the quiet knowledge of consequences. "It was for the king," the boy whispered. "They said it was important." Lyra's hands curled around her skirt. A vial of red liquid could have been medicine, ceremonial dye, an extract for candle wax. It might have been nothing. It might have been something. "What are they saying now?" she asked. He lifted his eyes at last. "Lord Harver says I stole it. He says I sold it to someone outside." His voice cracked. "I didn't. I swear." Lyra felt something in her chest tighten, the old, familiar sensation of being misjudged because it was convenient. She had been blamed for small things before. A missing ribbon. A forgotten errand. People looked for the easiest story, and the easiest story was usually about the person with the least power to protest. "Where is Lord Harver?" she asked. "In the audit chamber." The boy scrubbed at his face with his sleeve. "They'll send me away. Maybe worse." The palace didn't execute servants. It didn't need to. Dismissal meant returning to villages that distrusted palace workers, or wandering with the mark of disgrace. It meant hunger that was slow and ordinary and very real. Lyra stood, lifting the linen basket again. Her heart was beating too fast, not from drama, but from that quiet knowledge, if you speak, you will be noticed. And being noticed in this place can be dangerous. She looked at the boy's trembling hands. "What's your name?" she asked. "Fen," he whispered. "Fen," Lyra said, "come with me." He stared at her as if she'd offered him a lantern in a dark room. "Where?" "To tell the truth," she said, and surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. "You don't have to do it alone." The audit chamber sat off the central corridor, a room lined with ledgers and sealed cabinets. Lyra had never been inside. Servants were not meant to be. But she had spent enough time around storerooms to know that every item in the palace had a place, and every place had a record. Truth, if you searched for it patiently, often left a paper trail. At the door, a guard, vampire, pale-eyed, raised a hand. "Staff are not permitted." Lyra's mouth went dry. She could have turned away. She could have told Fen to go in alone and wished him luck. That would have been safer. It would have been normal. Instead she said, "Fen is accused of theft. I found him crying in the pantry corridor. If he is innocent, it will be discovered faster if someone who knows the pantry records is allowed to speak." The guard's gaze rested on her. It wasn't threatening. It was simply assessing, like a blade laid gently against cloth. After a moment, the guard opened the door. 5 minutes. The room smelled of ink and dust, old paper, and polished wood. Lord Harver sat at a long table, his expression composed as winter. Fen shrank behind Lyra's skirt as they stepped in. Lord Harver's eyes flicked over Lyra. "Who are you?" "A laundry maid," Lyra said, because honesty was the only ground she had. "My name is Lyra." "A laundry maid has no business in an audit chamber." "I agree," Lyra said softly. "But Fen has no business being accused of something he did not do." Harver's gaze sharpened. "You claim to know that?" "I claim that blame is not the same as proof," Lyra said, feeling the words rise from a place she hadn't used in a long time. "If you will allow it, I can tell you what I know." He gestured slightly, as if permitting a small annoyance to continue. Lyra took a breath. The steward's tray passed through the pantry corridor before it went to the royal wing. "It always does, I've seen it." She nodded toward a ledger on the shelf. The pantry ledger records every vial and bottle removed from storage, and which hand carried it. If the vial Fen broke was taken from storage today, it will be in the ledger. If it was already on the tray from before, it will not. Fen has only worked here 2 weeks, he would not have the knowledge to steal something that isn't recorded. Lord Harver's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward the ledger shelf. Lyra continued, more quietly, because she could feel her courage thinning like fabric stretched too far. If the vial was fragile, it could have rolled. There are gaps in the boards near the pantry door. I've tripped there myself. If you are searching for the easiest story, you will find Fen. If you are searching for the true one, you will check the boards and the ledger. For a moment, the only sound was the soft tick of a clock. Then Lord Harver rose and crossed to the shelf. He pulled the ledger down and opened it with precise hands. His eyes moved across the page, and something in the air shifted, not dramatic, not sudden, but like a lock turning. He looked at Fen. What was the vial's seal? Fen swallowed. Blue wax. With a silver stamp. Harver's finger traced an entry. The vial removed this morning had green wax. He turned a page, scanned another list, then closed the ledger with a quiet finality. His gaze went to Lyra, and for the first time she felt not his authority but his attention. The vial was not taken from pantry storage today, he said. It was likely prepared in the alchemy room. Fen let out a sound that was half sob, half breath. Lord Harver's eyes narrowed slightly. Fen will return to his duties. The boards by the pantry door will be repaired before evening. And you, his gaze flicked to Lyra. Return to your post. Lyra bowed quickly, relief making her knees weak. She didn't wait for permission to leave. She simply guided Fen out of the room and into the corridor, where the air felt easier to breathe. Fen clutched her hand with sudden fierceness. "Thank you," he whispered. Lyra squeezed his fingers once. "Stay careful," she said. "And when you make mistakes, which you will, because you're human, tell the truth quickly. It hurts less than carrying fear." That night, Lyra lay in her narrow servant's bed and stared at the ceiling beams. She expected to feel triumphant. Instead she felt trembling and strangely empty, as if her courage had been a borrowed coat she had returned, leaving her chilled. What if Lord Harver decided she had overstepped? What if the guard remembered her face? What if being noticed meant being watched from now on? Her small errors weighed more heavily. She thought of her ex's words again, not because she wanted to, but because the mind goes to familiar wounds the way the tongue goes to a sore tooth. "No one will ever marry you." In the village, those words had meant, you will never be chosen. You will never be worth someone's public commitment. You will always be the one who stands a little to the side. Here, in the palace, chosen meant something else entirely, and yet the ache was similar. It wasn't romance she missed. It was the feeling of being seen honestly. The next morning, she found an envelope on her work table in the laundry chamber. It was unmarked except for a seal pressed into dark wax, a crescent moon over a rising sun. Her hands paused. She had seen that symbol only once, carved above the door to the royal wing, a sign of the king's household. She looked around. No one was watching. The other servants were busy with sheets and steaming vats. Lyra broke the seal carefully, as if it might crumble into dust. Inside was a single folded card. "Lyra of the laundry chambers," it read, written in neat, spare script. "Truth spoken gently is a rarer service than silence. You will not be punished for yesterday's honesty. Continue your work in peace." No signature. No flourish. Just those sentences, calm as a hand laid briefly on a shoulder. A second item slipped out with the card, a small brass token on a ribbon, stamped with the same crescent and sun. The kind of token that allowed passage through certain corridors without question. Lyra's throat tightened. Not in a dramatic rush, but in a slow, unexpected warmth that made her blink hard. She did not imagine the king had sat up late thinking about her. She did not imagine any personal attachment. The message felt more like an acknowledgement of principle than affection, and that was somehow more meaningful. It suggested that somewhere in the unseen machinery of the palace, someone had noticed her choice and decided it should not cost her safety. When she tied the ribbon inside her apron pocket, her hands stopped shaking. In the following days, nothing outwardly changed, and yet everything felt slightly different. Fen passed her in the corridor and gave her a quick, bright smile before hurrying on. The pantry door boards were repaired, neat and level. Lord Harver no longer looked through her as if she were a chair. Once, when he walked past her carrying a stack of documents, he gave a small nod, barely a motion, and yet it landed inside her like a stone dropped into water, sending quiet ripples. Sir Caldema the librarian paused one morning beside the water barrel. "I heard there was a misunderstanding resolved," he said. His voice held the faintest trace of approval, like a candle flame sheltered from wind. You did well." Lyra didn't know what to say to praise. Praise made her suspicious. It had too often been the preface to being asked for more than she could give. So she simply said, "I did what I could." That became her private vow. Not a grand promise spoken beneath chandeliers, not a binding of lives. Just a small, sturdy decision she could carry in her chest: "I will do what I can, and I will not be ashamed of being ordinary." A week later, the palace held a quiet ceremonial gathering in the Hall of Lanterns. It wasn't a feast. It wasn't a spectacle. It was the annual renewal of agreements between the vampire court and the human staff, an exchange of formal words meant to keep the peace in a world that easily forgot its own fragility. Servants stood along the walls, hands folded, eyes lowered. Vampires gathered in the center in dark finery, still as statues. Lyra stood near the back, close enough to see but far enough to remain part of the wallpaper. When the king entered, the hall didn't erupt into noise. It softened. Even the lantern flames seemed to steady. He walked with unhurried grace, surrounded by attendants, his presence less like threat and more like gravity, quiet, inevitable. He stopped before the dais, and a steward read the ritual lines about protection, duty, restraint. The words were old and polished. Lyra listened, not because she expected them to change her life, but because she had learned that listening was a kind of respect she could offer without losing herself. Near the end of the ceremony, another steward stepped forward and spoke a new line, one Lyra had never heard before. By the king's courtesy, the steward announced, "A human voice is chosen this season to carry concerns directly to the household, a companion of dawn, sworn not in romance, but in trust." A murmur ran through the human line, quickly swallowed by silence. Lyra felt her stomach tighten. She did not want to be chosen for anything. Being chosen meant attention. Attention meant expectation. Expectation meant the possibility of failure. The steward's gaze moved along the servants, then stopped. "Lyra of the laundry chambers," he said. For a breath, Lyra didn't move. She was certain she had misheard, the way people misheard their names in crowds when they secretly feared being called. Then Mora's broad hand pressed gently against her back. "Go on," Mora muttered, voice thick with something that might have been pride. "You've earned your feet." Lyra stepped forward, the hall seeming longer than it had any right to be. She kept her eyes on the stone floor, on the pattern of pale veins in dark marble. Her hands were damp inside her sleeves. When she reached the space before the dais, she finally lifted her gaze, just enough to orient herself. The king's face was calm, unreadable. He did not smile. He did not beckon. His eyes rested on her with the same measured distance he likely gave to stars, to wars, to centuries. And yet she remembered the note, the token, the quiet protection. She remembered Fenn's trembling hands and the simple choice to tell the truth. The steward offered her a small ribbon in the crescent and sun colors. "Do you accept the courtesy?" he asked. Lyra heard her ex's voice in her mind again, as if it had waited all this time for a final answer. "No one will ever marry you." She understood now that those words had never been about marriage. They had been about worth. About whether she deserved a place where her honesty mattered. She took the ribbon with steady fingers. "I accept," she said, her voice clear enough to carry in the lantern-lit hush. "Not because I am special, but because I will speak carefully and truthfully for those who cannot stand here." A pause followed, quiet, thoughtful. Then the king inclined his head, just once, in a gesture so small it could have been missed by anyone not watching closely. Lyra did not feel swept into a new life. She did not feel rescued. She felt something subtler and more durable, the return of her own spine. After the ceremony, she went back to the laundry chambers. The sheets still needed folding. The vat still needed stirring. Fen still needed reminding to slow down when he carried trays. Life remained made of simple things. But when she walked through the corridor, the guard at the audit chamber door no longer lifted a hand to stop her. He simply glanced at the token at her waist and stepped aside. That night, as the palace settled into its soft, candlelit quiet, Lyra sat by the narrow window of her room and watched the first hint of dawn lighten the sky. She thought of how the vampires called the vow a courtesy. How humans called it a bridge. How her village had called marriage a proof that someone wanted you. Lyra breathed in the cool air and let it settle her. Perhaps being chosen did not have to be about possession, or romance, or someone else deciding your value. Perhaps it could be about trust earned through small moral choices, again and again, until your own heart believed you belonged somewhere. She touched the ribbon folded beside her bed. In the distance, the palace bells marked the hour with a low, steady tone. No one had promised her a perfect life. No one had given her a grand reward. But she had been protected without being owned, recognized without being displayed. And most importantly, she had proven to herself that she could step forward when it mattered, even with shaking hands. Outside, the sunrise spread slowly over the garden roofs, turning the world the color of new linen. Lyra watched it with quiet eyes and felt, for the first time in a long while, a gentle, unforced peace, like dignity returning home.